particular environmental situations. We won't know if we don't connect and speak about that. So the idea tonight is that we created some regional tables and ask that during the break you introduce yourselves to each other and actually note what your interests are so that we can know who shares what interests. They could be as general as water, or you could be someone like me who's into bees. So that's a sense of the spread. And one way to begin is if you would be so kind as to write the name of your town on your name tag. That way, every time I meet you, I remember where you come from. The other thing is to notice that at your table you have a form where you could add your name, your email address, and the city that you either come from or frequent. You know, some of us live in San Mateo, but we work in San Jose, and we might have a dual city thing. And if you could write down your interest next to your name, that would probably be helpful. The long-term goal is to link us to the 3 prior groups of environmental stewards. So there were another 80 people out there that we can meet and who have also gone through this training. And so we're going to cook up some reasons to get together in the future where we can all share interests. So that's the idea. I look forward to getting to know the people who live near Foster City, Belmont, San Carlos, and Redwood Shores. Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any other announcements? Okay, greetings. My name is Dave Olson, and I wanted to talk a little bit about water tonight. Here's our agenda. We're going to watch a film that lasts about an hour and 15 minutes called Water and Power, a California Heist. And I'm going to do a little bit of a general presentation beforehand and afterwards. So feel free to interrupt me anytime. We're a small enough group. If you don't understand something or you want clarification on some topic, feel free to put your hand up and ask a question. So it's very informative. So I thought I'd start with the drought in California, which is kind of funny, but a year ago, things were looking pretty bad. We had 5 years of very low rainfall, and the cumulative deficit over those 5 years was really huge, a huge deficit. So this is Lake Orville, which where you probably heard, has had a dam spillway problems. And that's the way it looked a year or 2 ago. And then here's Lake Mead, another huge source of water. It continues to go lower and lower, and they're building a lower pipe than exists in the original dam now, so they can keep taking water out of the river as it goes down. So things are not looking good in general, and although the whole watershed for Lake Mead this year is having a little bit more rain, this problem in Lake Mead will continue for years. So here's just a funny picture of the way California seemed a year ago, and how things change. So the major impacts of the drought, if we were talking about this a year ago, we'd be talking about all these things. Declining ecosystems and fisheries, less agricultural production and employment. Lots of people, you might have heard, in California actually lost their tap water. Not a very high percentage of California, but there were several communities which ended up getting emergency shipments of water from the state. Groundwater depletion has become a really big deal, even just in the last year. There's some parts of the Central Valley where the land level has dropped more than a foot because of the amount of groundwater that's been sucked out of it, primarily for agricultural use. Temperatures above normal is actually a really bad thing. That means that we need even more water. And so we've had hot years the last 5 years too. Maybe this year will change that trend. Over 90 million trees have died during the drought over the last few years. Less hydroelectricity was produced, less than 50% of the normal amount of hydroelectricity was produced. I think that was for 2015. There's one bit of good news is there was quite a bit of cooperation for people in California, and water use in the cities or by urban users went down 25%. So that was a really positive thing that happened. So that's all changed now. So those were the topics a year ago. Now the topics are really different. Year to date, we've had about 180% of normal precipitation on average across California. The northern part of California's had a little more. Southern California's had slightly less than that, but still Southern California is now well ahead of their normal rainfall year to date. Everybody's going to have some water this year. It's not clear yet whether all farmers will get everything they ask for, but there's going to be a lot more water given to agricultural industry this year. Ecosystems are also getting a lot more. Interesting thing, reservoirs, which are normally, or the last 5 years anyway, have been managed almost exclusively for water storage, are now being managed for flood control. So even Lake Shasta would be completely full right now if they weren't letting water out to allow for more snow melt. And since there is a really large accumulation of snow in the Sierras and in the Cascades, there is going to be a lot of runoff. And so in a month or two, the water managers will stop worrying about floods and they'll focus more on just retaining as much water as they can. And lastly, the water infrastructure is being tested and assessed in a way it hasn't been in a long time. The last time it rained a whole lot was over 20 years ago in terms of comparing it to this year. So the infrastructure is being tested. We'll come back to that a little bit. So you probably read about widespread flooding and levee breaks on a number of occasions. None of the levee breaks have gotten a huge amount of publicity because they haven't affected a huge amount of farmland or a huge amount of people yet, but there are 2 islands in the Delta that had levee breaks and they flooded. The good news is both of those islands were designated as potential wetlands in the future. And so that process has now been sped up a little bit. There's all kinds of stories about road decay and bridges failing. Maybe you know Highway 1 is now shut down for probably the next 6 months because of a bridge that failed near Big Sur. And so now there's no access to a stretch of the coast there without driving hundreds of miles out of the way. And something you don't think about, or I used to not think about so much, I used to think of rain as just a wonderful thing, but it's actually increased pollution comes from runoff. So all of the toxins that our modern society produces, a lot of it gets left on the highways and in industrial facilities and commercial places. And so all the chemicals from agriculture, so until there's a flood, those impurities remain on land. And so now that we've had a real good flush, a lot of those impurities have been dumped into our waterways. I guess the good news is that they're diluted more than they would be, but there's also more of them that reach the waterways now than would in a normal year. So those are just a few of the things that now this year seem important as opposed to last year. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this. The main point of this slide is that trying to figure out how water is managed in California is actually incredibly complex. There are all these aqueducts which run all over the state, and it's also complex from a financial perspective and a legal perspective. So there's a bunch of federal agencies and a bunch of state agencies that manage these aqueducts, and the financial and legal rules that they follow are very complex, and they're sometimes overruled by the politics of the situation as well. So it's actually very hard to talk in general about California water, and it's a lot easier to talk about the specifics about what's going on in any one place. So just a couple of comments here. The 2 water distribution systems people talk about most are the Central Valley Project, which was the first big dam building effort in California, and that was driven by the federal government. In the 30s and 40s it started, and then the State Water Project started in the early 60s. And so the California Aqueduct actually shares water from both of those systems, but there are actually 2 different water systems that move tons of water in California. So Lake Shasta, for instance, is part of the Central Valley Project, the federally controlled system. And Lake Oroville, the second biggest lake in the state, was built by the State Water Project, and all aspects of its management are governed by the state. So there's a fair amount of cooperation because all these waters mingle again when they go through the delta, and then they mingle when they get pumped up into the San Luis Reservoir, if you know about that, just south of Gilroy. But they keep track of all these things, and they move water back and forth every year. So this last fact is kind of interesting. Moving and purifying water consumes an enormous amount of power in our state. I mean, those are enormous numbers. 30% of the natural gas and almost 20% of the electricity in the state is moving water. So it's a big energy-intensive and money-controlling issue. Water is influenced.
The natural gas is to produce the electricity to move the water? Is that
part of it is, yeah. That's
and
exactly.
what's the rest of it?
I guess that's what it all is, actually.
Power
Yeah.
generation.
I'm sorry?
Power generation.
Power generation.
Pumps and pumps.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the pumps are all driven by electricity, so good question. So the Delta is a very complicated place. The two big rivers and all their tributaries flow through the Delta. The Sacramento drains Northern California, and the San Joaquin drains Central California. And so the Delta is where all this water meets. Those of you who've driven around the Delta realize that the Delta is just a collection of islands protected by levees. And it's kind of interesting to imagine before those levees were built what the Delta was like. It was this big marshland. So in wet years like this year, it was just flooded completely. And now the floods are directed between the levees to wander through the Delta and out to the San Francisco Bay. Yeah, so it's all farmland that is operated below sea level and protected by these levees, which occasionally fail, as you can see in the picture right there. The interesting thing about the Delta is it's complicated and involves so many different issues that its complications prevent the state from making strong decisions to resolve water issues because they just get really complicated. I mean, in drought years, saline water from San Francisco and San Pablo Bays moves up the Delta and diminishes the water quality there so that even the farmers who normally get water from just pumping water out of the Delta into their farmland have higher and higher saline salt percent in the water. And so that is one of the environmental issues that makes it hard. Just a general overview of how big the Delta is. So Oakland is basically right here, and there's Stockton, and then Sacramento is just above and to the right a little bit up there. So for those of you not real familiar with it. Okay, so fish and wildlife are a big concern, certainly for environmentalists. And the first point is about pollution. We talked about that a little bit. Ecosystem health is a function of the water available, of course. So in high flow years, we have higher water quality in general. And you probably heard about the Delta smelt, these little fish that are only 2 inches long, and that are threatened with extinction. A lot of them have gotten sucked up in the pumps that feed the California aqueduct. So if you look at, so right at the very bottom of here, you see this Clifton Court forebay. So the San Joaquin River comes in here, the Sacramento River comes up here, and then you have the Consumas River, and then the McCalloway River, and the Stanislaus River coming in on the east side. And normally all the water would flow this way, but on a drought year, when there's not much flow into the Delta, what happens is, this is where both the state and federal water project pump water into the California aqueduct to feed Southern California. All the streams or the waterways down here flow backwards instead of flowing this way. They flow this way to provide enough water to pump south. And so that ends up sucking up some fish and particularly the Delta smelt with the extinction. nice thing to know, agriculture uses about 80% of California's water consumption. So that's excluding the water that actually gets flushed out to sea. If you include water for agriculture and water for resident populations across the state and industry, all the controlled uses of water, agriculture is 80% of those. So groundwater has gotten a lot more attention in the last couple of years. California was the last state in the country to have any groundwater regulations. In 2014, the legislature passed and Governor Brown signed a groundwater law, which is now starting to be enforced. All of its requirements don't get in place until 2040. So there was a slow phase-in that was put in place partly to get acceptance of the bill. But anyway, that's really good news. So California does have a lot of groundwater. And note that first line there, 10 times the size of all the surface reservoirs combined. So we have a big resource that has been totally unmanaged, that still is totally unmanaged. Right now, if you own land in the Central Valley and you're a farmer, you can, as long as you're willing to pay for a pump, you can drill a well and pump 100% of what you want without any limitation whatsoever. So that will gradually go away over the next 10 or 15 years probably. But until these groundwater regulations are refined, farmers can pump as much water as they want. And then I'll explain that last point about mineral and salt buildup. So the cleanest water you can
Dave, I
get.
just want to add, just so people know, Santa Clara County has restrictions on groundwater. But San Mateo County, anyone can drop a straw down there and take as much water as they want. And they put up little signs saying, irrigated by well water. So you're like, that's not your water, this is well water. And it's frustrating because that's also should be considered public water, not just
Yeah, that's a
for
good
your
point.
golf course.
Santa Clara County was one of the first government organizations in the state to regulate groundwater because there was so much pumping of it. I forget when, in the 40s and 50s, I think, that there was massive subsidence in San Jose. And so all of a sudden, the major creeks in San Jose stopped flowing to the bay. I exaggerated a bit, but the subsidence was so significant they had to start managing groundwater withdrawal. So, yeah, good point, Keith, to that. So the Santa Clara Valley Water District is one of the best at groundwater management in the state. And this mineral and salt buildup occurs because groundwater has minerals and salt in it, and river water doesn't or has much less. So a farmer would rather not use groundwater because, particularly in the parts of the Central Valley where there are large tracts of land that won't drain to a river, if you keep irrigating every year with this mineral and salt tainted groundwater, then eventually it becomes hard to grow plants there. So there's a lot of issues associated with that. The biggest one you might have heard of is the Kesterson Reservoir, which filled with all this runoff years ago and ended up killing a lot of wildlife. Okay, so that was just a brief introduction to some big issues.
That was great.
Yeah.
This is a showing no one else in California has seen this one. Yes.
Yeah, no one else in California, did they somehow manage to get this built? It's brand new. We showed it at Sundance Festival a month ago.
It was in the New York
Yeah.
Times today.
Yeah, they weren't going to